So, a little bit on the background and history of business models. We had a start of research into strategy, especially for business strategy and so on. In the 50s and 60s, that became something of a field. And we, at the same time, or maybe a little bit earlier, also started to look into organizational theory. So 100 so years ago, or a little bit more, we mostly had manual production of everything. But when we started to build larger organizations, we started to build hierarchies, and a very interesting topic became how to do this, how to organize and divide up labor and put it all together in integration mechanisms so we make the whole thing work as best possible, right? And that would be, roughly speaking, organizational science. And strategy would be, how do we compete with other systems and what do we do to prepare for the future? So there's basically three things that came up in the 60s on organizing business activities. And one way to look at a firm is to, and it was all about the firm or even corporate, like the group, very, very high level. One way to look at it is to look at the structure, the formal structure of units and how they're connected to each other. This year we'll come back to when we look at growth next time, because growth tends to drive formalization of work in certain patterns. There are ways around that, but that also has to be conditions created to go around hierarchical structures. Hierarchies are very useful, but they're also restrictive. So we have pros and cons, and you can link it to the military and so on, how that works. But then we have also the actions that takes place, the processes, and that flows, in different ways. Could be, now it's mostly up down here, but it could also be between units, etc. And that is like a metaphor for that is like the firm's physiology. How does it work in terms of a biological creature, so to say? We need to have certain things. We need to have revenues. We need to have cost under control. We need to have safe work environments, etc. And then researchers also quickly noticed that it's not only that, but there's also something else, something like what we say in Sweden is in the walls, or it's in the atmosphere, etc. And we start to call that organizational culture. So patterns of values and thoughts and reasoning are not specified in hierarchy or in processes, but they still have an enormous impact on how things are done, and especially how we perceive our role in the environment or our role inside these structures, etc. So starting points were to start with one company, or you start with the company level and look at how is things connected here. How do these effects occur? Especially why are some performing better than others, etc. So 3 starting points there. Then I don't know the reason why especially, but it became more focus creep into from the big corporation level more into the focus on specific business units. And a business unit is something that is providing a range of products to a market. That's a strategic business unit. And that could be like a company in a corporation, a subsidiary or a division or whatever. So the formalization of that boundary is more fluffy, but it is competing against other business units on the market. And sometimes a company is a business unit, but if it's a large group, you usually have Volkswagen, for example. They have a business unit for cars and one for trucks probably, and a few others, maybe some services. But they all have a value proposition, and they have different markets, etc. And when you look at that, we were interested in the 80s on how do we win the competition against other rival companies. So the focus became more centered around the issue of competitive advantage, and starting with looking at some parameters which could give us better performance in terms of margin. And then if we can reinvest them into our advantage, we could have that as a sustainable competitive advantage over time. So how do we create a slightly superior margin in our little industry among our rivals? We don't want to be the one with the worst margins. We want to have better margins, and we can take some of those margins to improve our cost effectiveness. If we have a cost leader strategy, we don't have to be the lowest price provider. We take the same price as the others at our performance level, but we have a slightly more margin, and we can invest part of that into even better efficient operations and improve our cost advantage. Or we can have a slightly better product for a segment or overall, and we take a price premium and we get a little extra margin, and we invest that in improving our product continuously over time to get a sustainable competitive advantage. Now, that was a useful step, but it was pretty limited in terms of freedom. And researchers also started to look at large sets of firms, and were interested to see if there is any best way in how to organize firms given a certain strategy and so on. So looking at 1,000 firms in an industry, there was different clusters that were performing well and others that didn't. And they were interested in looking at, given that we have a certain strategy, like say a niche strategy or whatever, maybe there is a certain configuration on how you do things that is superior for that strategy. And for another strategy, maybe other things are critical. And that led to research that, we talked about organizational gestalts from the German word, like there's some types or ways to compete in the food industry that are useful. And it's not just these two of differentiation and cost leadership. It's, there's different ways that you can do, and it's contingent on strategy and environmental factors like what kind of customers you have, what kind of product it is, what the region and the technology development, change rate, etc. And that whole research, I don't think it led anywhere really. And there was a lot of good things done, but never came out with like a one way to look at it. And then in the 90s, there was a more focus inward in the strategic business unit, or in how it was organized with other parts of its environment, and exactly how things are done. So now, with the introspective look on how to build businesses and compete well, we start to look at resources, capabilities, and it came after a while to be understood that not only what the resources are, or so to say, but also how we are connecting them together. So one thing is the resource-based viewing strategy, which I'm not a great fan of, as you might have understood. It links advantage to whoever has some superior resource. And that is of course true, but if you look at innovation, like Schumpeter did, as a recombination of resources, it's really, that's what happens when you do an innovation. You put stuff together in a new way, but it doesn't explain anything. Describe it in a non-useful way. So I say that it's like saying that an artist painter like Michelangelo is about mixing colors. Yes, they mix colors, but how you became a world-leading renowned artist is how you do that, not that you do that, right? So, and one step was to look at, as in this example that you see, I think the boxes here, I would say something that they try to find the key success factors. And to achieve these, they put, together other ways, activities, but rather ways of doing things like subjective acceptance of clients. Yeah, different ways that support the success factors. Okay. Of course, this networking kind of thing was a good step in the right direction, I think. And we're still using that. But it's difficult to say any given way that is always the best way, right? It's more like if you would spend a lot of time in learning business, we should look at how systems work and how we make systems work more effectively as the whole system by changing stuff in it, taking something away, or adding something, or dividing the system. And that's not something that I think is done yet, actually, to a large degree. It's more like this high level that shows that it can be done, but practicing it is not really sufficiently done yet, I think. And then it started to be developed into what we now call business models. And business models, there are so many definitions. So these are two examples, but both these are connecting what's done internally with the external market. So here you have the customers or the market. Here you have the offering or value proposition. Here you have what's called a business system, or what we call in this course the value network. If you cut it in the middle, the downside is the internal world, the world of management, and the top side is the world of business, where you create and deliver value to customers. And the same here, but it's upside down comparably. And they put the value proposition inside the business boundary. So this would be a firm boundary. But today we also have many different firms activated in the same value proposition. So it's a little bit old fashioned, but in principle, there's a boundary around here, the organizational units that create a customer facing value proposition. So it starts to be gliding over to some sort of an ecosystem already within the one value proposition. But we see that we have assets, we have activities, etc. So we are starting to look at that. And if we connect to the right side model here, I use this one quite a lot. And it's because even though there is a network or a system here in the market where the customer has to do things because they have customers, they have needs, etc. So they are in the system and we can deliver something to improve their situation in that system, help them serve their customers, help them have a better life in different ways. And here is a system that is all the activities we need to organize to be able to deliver and charge something through a revenue model. And then the value proposition while you saw the functional map, it's also a system. So it's all a system, but we don't have to do that whole thing. This whole thing would be inside the value creation part that would be in the value network, or what I sometimes call a business system. But it's the internal activities, and they need to be having a good fit, because efficiency is doing things the right way. So efficiency here will create a value proposition in the optimal way. But effectiveness is about doing the right things. So that will be, how well does this thing that we have created fit into what enables a lot of benefits here on that level. So it's about our role in the external world, and the value we create for specific customer needs and use of resources is the way to model that. So it's, and in this strategic configuration, they discovered this idea of internal and external fit as two things that you need to be able to compete with your configuration in the market conditions. And here we can have that combined with the system view into something that we can work with. We don't have to work with everything at the same time. We can specify needs, and then we can model the value proposition, and then we can discuss how do we organize things in a system that can do this. What are the competing systems out there today? What weaknesses do they have, given that they are based on old technologies, old ways of doing things, old assets applied to solve the problems? So that's where we end up. And in this case, business model canvas of Osterwalder, it has these three parts here, and it has these three parts here on the left-hand side, and then the revenues and cost. So it's just if you want to link it to that to make it more easily understandable, it's just an abstraction of the 7 fields into 3 fields, 3 domains, so to speak. Okay, so that's the long story on business models made short. And that's where we are today. And now also something happened here, because we moved down in unit of analysis from the whole firm to a specific business model. So the firm can, of course, have many different business models for that different value propositions that they are doing. So it's not so interesting to look at Volvo competing with Mercedes as two companies. It's more interesting now to look at our value propositions of the Volvo S60 compared to the value proposition or whatever Mercedes 300 series or whatever is at the choice for the same customers. These two value propositions. Competition is not about what Volvo does and Mercedes does as big companies. It's about when the customer is choosing between the different offerings, they will actually be manifesting competition. That's where competition occurs. I don't buy Volvo, I buy a car and I compare different cars. Might be interested in the brand, but there are more than one brand that interests me. And I'm not interested in most cars or most brands. There's maybe 1 or 2 in some brands. So we moved from the company level to the product level in strategy. And we moved from company level as a system of activities and capabilities to a cluster of companies that we need to orchestrate as a collaboration of synergies, everybody doing what they're best at and connecting them into a joint value proposition. That could be visible from the customer's point of view or not. It's really just a choice in marketing. And sort of we done that all the time. because when we bought a car 20 years ago, we did the same thing as we do today. Of course, we choose between cars, but the research were maybe here and looking at how it worked. But even then, of course, Volvo had 80% of the stuff was done by sub-suppliers that they put together into a customer-facing value proposition. So the same thing happened, but now it's taking to another level with the internet connectivity that makes it possible to coordinate activities globally in real time in a way that is just massively different from 30 years ago or 20 years ago. So the idea of a company that has a supply chain, it's not, it's still valid, but if you want to make a unicorn, your thinking is, how do I get away from that, rather than how do I do that? It's how do I avoid doing that by organizing something that in time and space is accessible for customers all over the world at just one point and very simply. And, you know, if you want to make a car unicorn, you'll be selling cars, all sorts of cars, and help customers choose, rather than selling Volvo cars, because the customer wants to choose between these 3, 4, 5 models of different manufacturers that they're interested in. And they don't want to go to 5 different car stores or web pages. So you know, we want to really get away from that. Right. This is anyway my take on the background. It's been a long journey, but now we're at the level where it's more useful for actually making concrete business propositions in practice.